Greetings, loyal subjects. Now my attention was drawn this week to this meme, I believe you call them. Perhaps suggested that our new King, Charles III, should not have the title of Supreme Head of the Church of England because of the fact that he is a divorcee and he readily confessed to committing adultery on his first wife. This jovial prankster decided to wind up this particular person on Twitter by giving him a little picture of myself, suggesting that if King Charles III was going to blow his mind, then imagine what might happen when he heard about me. Obviously, my own exploits are somewhat well documented. 6 wives, 2 of them beheaded, 2 of them divorced, and a list of mistresses as long as your arm. Should I have had the title of Supreme Head of the Church in England? Who knows? One thing is for sure is that every monarch of England and subsequently the United Kingdom since me has been Supreme Head of the Church of England since my Act of Supremacy in 1534. There was a brief period where my daughter Mary removed that act, but Elizabeth brought it back. So the question is, how many of the monarchs that followed me had, shall we say, liaisons that may well be deemed inappropriate by the church, which they were the head of? Well, let's start with my daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth, as we all know, is famous as being the Virgin Queen, but she wasn't immune from scandal herself. Principally, those scandals revolved around one man, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. He was her master of the horse, and he was undoubtedly the one man that Elizabeth would have married if she had chosen to. Problem was, when Elizabeth was young and had just come to the throne, Robert Dudley was already married. Strange thing was, his wife, Amy Dudley, died under mysterious circumstances. She dismissed all of her servants to go to a local fair, and then when they returned, they found her dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs, her neck broken. Immediately, scandal hit Dudley that he'd arranged the murder of his wife so that he could marry the Queen. Elizabeth, very wisely at that point, decided to break off the whole Robert Dudley thing, and he left court for a while, and there was never any serious suggestion after then that Elizabeth would marry him, although he was still very clearly her favourite. Right, let's move on to James I of England and James VI of Scotland. He was married to Anne of Denmark, and on the face of it, they had a very successful relationship, having 7 children together. However, before his ascension to the English throne, up in Scotland, he had a well-known, open relationship with a woman called Anne Murray. When he became the King of England, Anne stayed in Scotland. Then other rumours started circulating that James favoured some of his young, handsome, male members of his court. 3 names in particular came up: Esme Stuart, the Duke of Lennox; Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset; and probably most famously, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Were these just rumours that were going around, or was the King of England really sleeping with his male subjects behind the Queen's back? The answer is probably yes. Around 10 years ago at 8 Fort Palace, building work was being undertaken. It was discovered that there was a secret passage that linked the bedroom that King James used to use and the bedroom that the Duke of Buckingham used to use. A contemporary Huguenot poet was even more blunt. He wrote in his journals that it is well known that the King of England the Duke of Buckingham. Couldn't be more blunt than that, could you? And in fact, Buckingham himself even admitted that he slept in the King's bed, although gave no information about what further activities might well have taken place in there. Charles I, even though he had his head chopped off for losing the English Civil War, was rather well behaved when it came to the ladies. So we'll move on to his son, Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch. He fathered 12 children, and not one single one of them was legitimate. He was well known for having numerous mistresses. At least 14 are known to historical record, but there are probably many, many more. The two most famous, firstly Barbara Villiers, the wife of the Earl of Castlemaine. Charles had a long-standing relationship with Barbara and they had 6 children together, all of them bearing the traditional surname Fitzroy that traditionally went with illegitimate sons and daughters of the king. In fact, I myself named my own illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, son of the king. The second most famous mistress was of course Nell Gwynne, the actress. She was described by Samuel Pepys as pretty, witty Nell. And it wouldn't be the last time that a King of England would get involved with an actress. Nell Gwynne's was really a Cinderella story. She was born of really unknown, lowly stock and built herself up to become the mistress of the King of England. But her first job in the theatre wasn't on the stage. She was actually hired to dress in very little clothing and then walk about amongst the gentlemen watching the show, selling oranges for 6 pence each. Interestingly, she called the King Charles III because she'd already had affairs with 2 other men called Charles. James II, the younger brother of Charles, actually married a commoner called Anne Hyde. He made her all kinds of promises and then he made her pregnant. And as a result, he married her. This was, of course, highly unusual back in the day for a king to marry a commoner. However, it didn't stop him taking mistresses. He had plenty, including Arabella Churchill. When Anne died, James, who was yet at this point to become king, remarried a 15-year-old Italian princess called Mary. The English Parliament got rid of James II because he was a Catholic, and instead they installed his daughter Mary II and her husband, William of Orange, on the throne. William was known as William III. Now all was well until Mary died. And at that point, William's popularity in the country began to plummet, almost certainly because he was a foreigner. And it was at this point rumours about his relationships with men started to circulate. And let's be very clear here, they were just rumours. There is no evidence. There were particular rumours around a man called Arnold Just van Keppel. He was handsome, 20 years his younger, and was essentially a lowly man at court who rather rapidly rose up through the ranks and got made an earl by the king. It was that made people suggest that he was somehow paying for his advancement in other ways. Well, the truth of the matter is, I'm sure we will never know. And now we come to Queen Anne, who married Prince George of Denmark. Anne's story is pretty tragic, in all honesty. She had at least 17 pregnancies, but not one of her children lived to adulthood. But as well as that relationship with her husband and all of those pregnancies, there were strong rumours that she was having a lesbian relationship with not one, but two of her ladies-in-waiting. Sarah Churchill, the wife of the hugely popular and influential Duke of Marlborough, and a lady called Abigail Massam. The two women in question actually hated each other, which only started fueling more of the rumours. There have been popular films made about this. Olivia Colman acted as Queen Anne, and I believe won an Oscar for her role. Again, whatever the truth of the matter is, we aren't going to know. Now we move over to the House of Hanover and George I. He was married to Sophia, but they very quickly became estranged, and both of them took lovers. Ultimately, the marriage was dissolved, and George kept her prisoner, refusing her access to her own children. He went on to have a mistress with whom he had 3 children with. Doesn't quite seem fair, does it? George II followed in his father's footsteps, having numerous mistresses. There was one long-term one that is well documented, Henrietta Howard, who was the Countess of Suffolk. George III didn't follow in his grandfather's footsteps. However, rather strangely, he married Queen Charlotte, but the first time he met her was on the day of the wedding. I mean, I agreed to that sort of thing once, and Anne of Cleves turned up. Remarkably, this wedding went very, very well, because George III never had any mistresses. Maybe he was too busy, losing America, being mad, and wait for it, fathering 15 children with his queen. Must have been a really happy relationship. Then we come to George IV, who was only slightly less mad than his father. Now, George IV was a character. You may know him better as the Prince Regent, because during the periods of his father's madness, he took over the powers of the king, before ultimately ascending to the throne himself. At 21, he became infatuated with a woman called Maria Fitzherbert, who was already twice widowed, and she was a Roman Catholic. He went and lived with her, basically, and in fact, he married her. Problem for young George was that the king, his father, hadn't given his consent to the marriage, so legally it was invalid. Young Prince George racked up debt after debt after debt, and now the king had some leverage against him. He promised to pay off the debt if he would marry respectably. And so he married Caroline of Brunswick. The two were not suited at all, and shortly after the birth of their only child, Princess Charlotte, the two formally separated. Soon emerged that he was still involved with Maria Fitzherbert, and that remained the case for the rest of his life. He never really abandoned her, despite having numerous mistresses. Mary Robbins was an actress. Grace Elliott was the wife of a top physician. Frances Villiers was the Countess of Jersey. Lady Anne Lindsay was a famous songwriter at the time. And then there was Lady Conyngham, another long-term mistress. William IV succeeded his brother George IV to the throne, and he picked up his elder brother's passion for actresses. Before he came to the throne, he lived openly with an Irish actress called Dorothea Bland, better known as her stage name, Mrs. Jordan. They were very happy. They had 10 children together and never married. However, when it became apparent that he may well inherit the crown, he decided it was time that he had to marry legitimately and within European royalty. He married Princess Adelaide, and after that he had no more mistresses and no more involvement with any other women apart from his wife. yet they had no children. So the crown then passed to one of our most famous monarchs, Queen Victoria. Now, she was famously devoted to her husband, Prince Albert, and she went into a long period of mourning after his death. However, in her later years, there was a certain amount of scandal around her. She became very friendly with one of her Scottish manservants called John Brown. In fact, it went as far as rumours were being published in print that the Queen had married John Brown, and people around court would openly refer to her as Mrs. Brown. Of course, there is no evidence of that marriage or any romantic involvement ever taking place. And finally, we come to Edward VII, the eldest son of Queen Victoria. He'd been heir to the throne for 60 years. He'd married Princess Alexandra of Denmark, and he'd had 6 children with her. However, that didn't stop him from seeing other women. It is believed that Edward VII had over 190 lovers during his lifetime, making me look like somewhat of an amateur when it came to the ladies.